video podcast on Friday, May the 12th. Brent crude down around 74.5, something like that. It just can't seem to get any long-term traction above 75 these days. We're going to discuss why with three of the best in the business. Let me welcome Peter Maguire, CEO of XM Brokers, back in Sydney, Australia, after his world tour, which included Dubai. Matthew Wright, Senior Freight Analyst at Kepler in London. And Andrew Critchlow, Head of News for Middle East at S&P Global Commodity Insights, also in London. Welcome, the three of you. Let's have a good talk. Let me ask Peter first. On this weakness in crude, the usual suspects are being wheeled out. Weak US and Chinese economic data, though I can't really see anything in either of those countries that has changed significantly. Maybe, some further rumblings in the American banking sector. Pacific West, the latest one, is a firing line. So, Peter, what's going on? Why the weakness?
Well, Frank and my fellow guests, I think it's just volatility, Frank. It's been all over the shop. We've seen quite an incredible week if you're looking, as far as big market swings. Structural weakness. I think some were fairly bullish that we would have seen $75 to $80, maybe even in this rally, and it just hasn't materialized. That for WTI, it's well off, and you're broaching that $70 range. So you've got the Chinese numbers, though overall demand still is very, very strong for global, and I'm interested to see how it rolls over the Northern Hemisphere summer with driving season and possibly an uptick. The Chinese numbers are a bit worrying, but and they came out, out of the gates fairly strong after Lunar New Year, but they haven't bloomed since then. So US dollar still sitting at 102 for that US dollar index. Currencies are choppy. Smart money found gold, and I think a lot of the trading money may have been sitting on sidelines because of the large swings you've seen in crude oil energy prices. And I noticed that copper was well off overnight, Frank.
You still like gold, don't you, Peter? Tell us about that. Give us the brief spiel on gold, if you would.
Well, last Thursday, Frank, a week ago, we hit an all-time high, 2,072 odd. So it was not a bad number, but then it cratered on the Friday back to around 2008, back at around, I think, 2012 at the moment. But it's been very wild, very volatile. And I think many people you mentioned the banking situation in the States, debt ceiling. There's a lot of big themes that I think macro themes that are going to show gold to see it better days ahead over the rest of this year. Number of big banks are forecasting 2,200, even 2,300 for some of them. So it may materialize. We'll just have to see where it goes for US dollar and whether we see some major, dislocations to the market with debt ceilings, Biden and Congress.
Right. Andy Critchlow, on oil, back to oil. We're in the countdown period to the next OPEC Plus meeting on June the 4th. And OPEC yesterday kept its forecasts unchanged for 23 growth at 2.3 million barrels a day, which is and was also maybe a little more positive on China in terms of economic outlook and demand. But tell me, how do you think OPEC Plus policymakers are thinking ahead of that meeting?
Well, it's difficult to gauge. Everyone was surprised by the voluntary cuts of 1.6 million barrels a day. That was a bit of a shock to the market. They got a bit of a bump. Of course, that's driven by the economic necessity of keeping prices above $80 a barrel for the core Gulf producers. And, we saw a hint of that from the IMF, putting their fiscal break even for Saudi Arabia just a pinch above $80 a barrel the other day. We're relatively actually bullish where we see oil going, because we do see things, tightening through June to September when you get these peak seasonal demands, especially in the US with driving season. And of course, oil inventory levels, we haven't seen a lot of excess crude going into stocks because there isn't any with OPEC and these voluntary cuts. So, at the moment we're hovering, just under $80 a barrel. A little bit of a weakness, but through into Q3, the fundamentals seem to suggest that dated Brent, and this is our call, S&P Global Commodity Insights will be up near $90 a barrel, and at those levels, no one's complaining. And kind of coming back to Peter there, that as a former expat Aussie based down there in Sydney, I think that watching the Australian trade data into China is something that goes missed by a lot of Northern Hemisphere analysts. And Australia exported, I think, its record numbers in March to China. I think it was something like 19 billion Aussie dollars of trade, and of course that's all driven by iron ore. And my kind of anecdote around oil prices is, if you really want the canary in the coal mine, go to Port Hedland and just count the number of bulk carriers that are loading iron ore, and I'll give you a pretty good indication of where oil prices are going, given the importance of China.
I'm going to ask Peter about Aussie trade a bit later on, Andy.
I don't want to steal your fire.
Okay. From what you're saying, it seems as though the June meeting will leave things unchanged, and OPEC Plus will trust in a price increase in the third and fourth quarters. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be the mood music. Certainly, no one wants to make a call on them, changing anything in terms of of output. And there's so much economic uncertainty out there. You had the Bank of England increasing rates to 4.5% yesterday. That's on the back of the Fed. Central banks are still in a tightening phase, and although the messaging has signaled that process is coming to an end, there is a perception that the inflation, that the major economies are starting to get a handle on that. But that's all driven actually by these weaker commodity prices. You've got to see that you've had a massive pullback in gas prices, natural gas prices in Europe, which was a major driver for CPI in Eurozone and the UK. And, you had a similar story in the US with higher commodity prices filtering through to inflation. Now, there are no promises that this isn't going to come back. And a lot of this is wrapped around geopolitics. So if the geopolitics changes, we could have a different situation. And my view is that the key moment for energy prices this year is what happens in Ukraine and what happens with this very much flagged counteroffensive.
Okay, we're going to talk about that, Andy, as well. Yeah, we will talk at length about that.
I'm getting ahead of myself all the time.
You are. You've obviously read my script.
Yeah. I've had my coffee today.
Matthew, right, you keep an eye on the volumes of floating oil in transit on ships or in storage on the oceans. And at one stage, there was a hell of a lot of that, wasn't there? What's it looking like now? And how big a factor is that in the weak price of oil that we've seen?
We look at both. So we look at both floating storage and crude on water. So when you look at, commodities on water has obviously gone up a lot over the last year. It's because we've got, not necessarily because we've got a massive increase in exports, just purely because crude is traveling further than ever before. And looking at the data at the moment, it's actually coming off a little bit. There's a couple of reasons for that. I think China took a little bit less of sort of Russian Urals, Russian Western crude. So we're not seeing that go quite as far as before. And actually on floating storage, just updating it now, we had a bit of an increase over April, but a lot of that was Iranian. Iranian barrels make up the bulk of floating storage, but a lot of that cleared into China. And now we're back down around 100 million barrels. And this is down from, 150 over, maybe a year ago. So floating storage is down, but that completely makes sense with the market structure. You don't really want to have a lot of barrels sitting around. And commodities on water is very high, but we're not seeing it grow at the moment. And I would say that is consistent with the fact that Russia's pivot to Asia is largely complete. They have exhausted all opportunities in China and India, really. So there's not a huge amount more, ton miles on the tanker side that they can generate.
Right. Also, Matt, you were making a point earlier about tanker rates, VLCC rates. Tell me about that.
Yeah, and it kind of ties back to the points the other guys were making earlier, which is we've got this bit of weakness in the market. I think it's just seasonal. We're going to go through a bit of a summer lull for VLCC rates and more broadly for crude tanker rates. We look at China, we've got 1.3 million barrels a day of refinery maintenance offline this month. That's going to be the peak. it's actually by Chinese standards not a particularly large amount of offline capacity, but it's still going to be the weakest point this year. China's the biggest demand driver of VLCC rates, so that's important. And also heading into the summer, we've got refinery runs increasing in the Middle East. We've got direct crude burn, so that could reduce and the cuts on top, of course, depending on where they come in. So that could reduce crude exports by around 1 million barrels a day. So there is like fundamentals behind it that support this decline in rates. I do think it's a seasonal lull because when you actually look at the tanker market more broadly, there's a lot still sort of holding up levels. We're not looking at a downward crash and back to sort of 2020, 2021 levels of below $1 a barrel rates. But it's definitely the worst time for VLCCs in 12 months or so.
Peter, over in your part of the world, I read that the Australian Trade Minister is or was in Beijing to talk trade with his counterparts there, and full trade relations have been resumed or are being resumed. Tell us about that. And, is that a straw in the wind possibly for US-China relations?
Well, I think first off, Frank, China is reliant on our natural resources and many other commodities. So there's the first part. And as Andy said, well, the numbers that were achieved in March were nothing short of outstanding. The biggest ever. And it's also from a manpower standpoint, I've got numerous friends that work in that sort of area of the world, northern parts of Western Australia, and the demand for manpower is enormous. So everyone that wants a job gets a job in Australia, and our unemployment is at nearly record lows. So it's strong economically. We're bringing in, they say, 400,000 people to our shores as net migration over the next 12 to 15 months. And so that's another part of the whole equation. As far as our trade minister over there, yes, to smooth the waters, to get us back on track after the COVID situation, and probably just to settle down maybe some angst that was on Main Street with our alignment with the US and so on. So I think that's just a natural part of doing, a trade talk business, Frank, at government level.
Okay. Andy, I want to ask you about the war in Ukraine. You mentioned earlier, but you understand these things with your background. We've been waiting a long time now for the Ukrainian offensive, hearing and reading about it, and the fact that it's imminent any day. President Zelensky said this week that we must all be patient. Other Ukrainian officials seem to be downplaying the prospects for what it will achieve. So, you tell us, when is it coming? Has Ukraine sufficient weapons and manpower to mount it?
Yeah, I'm going to have to put my former soldier hat back on here, Frank. I think that there's some interesting analysis and debate about this, and it is very interesting that it has been flagged so prominently by policymakers. It's not just the Ukrainians, President Zelensky talking about this, and Ukrainian commanders, on the front line, openly giving interviews to major news organizations about this upcoming counteroffensive. And then, I think that there are a lot of historical comparisons which are actually quite worrying around this. Now, of course, the counteroffensive is being empowered by the massive transfer of sophisticated defense equipment. And, we just had a news story out of the UK about the supply potentially of Storm Shadow missile technology, which are these missiles which have a range in excess of around 250 kilometers, which in terms of Ukraine's force projection really opens up their capability in terms of striking back against Russia and taking the campaign really to Russia, which is the objective of the counteroffensive. And then you've got heavy armor, other military equipment. So they're building up all these tanks. Now, something similar actually happened in 1943 in a very similar area around Kursk, where the Germans launched a massive counteroffensive to seize back the initiative from Russia, and it failed. And primarily it failed because there was a difference of opinions in terms of what they should do. One side said they should delay, build up more heavy tanks and armor because they were bringing on stream these new weapons, and then the other side the commander on the ground said, no, we need to go now. We need to go quickly before the Russians build defense in depth. And what we're now seeing in terms of a lot of the intelligence reports coming back from Russia that are being made very public by things, institutions like the Ministry of Defense here in the UK, is that the Russians are digging in. They're building defense in depth. The Russian army is very good at defending territory. And I think that, this is the difference. They proved to be not so good at taking territory, and that's where they've lost the initiative in the war in Ukraine. So I think there are worrying comparisons here. And of course, the Kursk initiative, the Battle of Kursk in 1943, the grand aim of that was to seize the Caspian oil fields. Right. You could make the argument again in Ukraine that this battle around Bakhmut and the expected counteroffensive, actually, what's at stake here? Well, it's oil. And, we're going to have an OPEC seminar in July. We've got an OPEC meeting in June. I think that it has created a lot of tension with Western allies, OPEC's refusal to cast Russia aside. In fact, the alliance is stronger probably than ever. If Russia is under pressure due to this counteroffensive that comes, if the Ukrainians are successful in pushing Russia out of their territory, does Russia then strike back in terms of weaponizing oil and gas more than it already has?
Well, it has to a great degree already, hasn't it?
To a great degree already. What more can it do?
Yeah.
I think that this is interesting. What's really at stake in this counteroffensive, in my view, is actually what happens with energy markets in the next 2 to 5 years, essentially, because you've had this, gigantic kind of discombobulation of energy markets. You've had Urals pushed out of Europe. You've had this huge shift in trade flows from Russian commodities going into Europe, going into the Atlantic Basin, now coming into Asia. That story has started to play out. If the counteroffensive is successful, Russia fails, does the regime in Moscow survive? Do you get normalization? Of course, sanctions which have been imposed on Russia, they're not going away. And even if you've got a change in regime, in Russia,
take a long time for those sanctions
to be removed. Take an awful long time for those sanctions to change. So that
Matt,
shift is going to change.
We will continue on this subject, but I just want to go to something that Matt said. You said that the pivot to Asia by Russia is largely complete. Is that right? Have they really moved everything east?
Yeah, I mean, there's not absolutely everything. I think in terms of crude, India and China account for about 70% of Russian crude exports. It was actually higher. It was actually closer to 80% 2 or 3 months ago. It's come down a little bit. So, in theory, there's more, but it's not all about India and China. There's other willing buyers. And I think, Andrew makes a very good point, which is, the sanctions aren't going away. It would take a huge political effort for Russia to be brought back in by the West. And I think that's an important thing. We talk about this from a Western point of view, where the countries who are sanctioning and have shunned the oil, there's plenty of countries out there, as we've seen on the refined product side, who are very willing to take discounted Russian barrels of crude and diesel, especially. And they're really only just starting to, it's only been since February that they've been exploring these new buyers in West Africa, Brazil, North Africa, Turkey, and as we've seen in the Middle East, Middle East is taking record amounts of Russian diesel. So I think we are, the sanctions are working in the sense that people are heeding them, but the other part of the sanction that's working is the flows are still moving, which was always the point.
Okay, yeah, that was the idea, wasn't it? Let me go back to the Kursk analogy. Andy, because David Rundell, who I'm sure most of you know, said on this show earlier this week that Russian defeat was impossible, and we should all accept that and get ready to hand over vast chunks of Ukraine to Putin, which many people think would be entirely unacceptable and a recipe for further Russian aggression in the future. Tell me about that scenario, Andy.
I'm a little bit more on the fence around that. And I think, from my own personal experience in the military, I think that the impact of modern Western technology on the battlefield is underestimated here. And I think, you've already seen a large element of that in how the transfer of sophisticated Western military technology, like drone technology, like some of the eye in the sky intel that has been supplied to Ukraine, has kept the Ukrainian military very much on the front foot there. Russia doesn't really have that capability. Its economy is on life support, certainly. Without its cooperation with OPEC Plus and that its success, admittedly, in transferring flows of crude and gas into Asia, finding new markets, in that working within the sanctions regime, which have been designed actually to kind of keep the Russian economy on life support perversely. I think they're in a precarious position. And I think with the scale of the transfers that have been shipped now to Ukraine militarily, of course, Ukrainians want more. They want sophisticated fighter jets. They want more ability to project power and go on.
They have enough now, Andy, to do what? To kick the Russians out of all Ukrainian territory, Crimea included. What can they do with what they've got?
They certainly have the capability to go on the offensive. It's difficult to say if you're not on the ground. I'm just reading the intelligence reports that are made public at the moment, as everyone else is. I think clearly a lot is at stake, and this is why this is being delayed. The military planners on the ground clearly have a red line that they want to get to in terms of ammunition, in terms of equipment, in terms of supplies, which is being sent to Ukraine from the West. And until they get to that point, they're not comfortable launching the offensive. The key thing here, and I think the really important thing, Frank, is they've got one shot. They have one shot at this. And if it goes wrong, then there is a big problem. Because they're just not going to shift Russia from that, and then this conflict then becomes intractable. And yeah, exactly.
Peter, from your point of view, from a layman's point of view, can we think about the possibility of a Russian defeat, or at least a reverse serious enough to force Putin to some kind of negotiation, some kind of climb down?
Well, I mean, I sit here from Sydney, Australia, probably one of the most remotest parts of the world, Frank, compared to where you guys are sitting, and certainly into Russia. And we're concerned about it. But when you present that argument, I don't know how it's going to end. It's just protracted. It just keeps on rolling along, and I'm not sure what the end game is. And this is the story. I mean, I listen to Andy, and and I'm conscious of what's going on with all the media presentations, and I just don't know what the end game is. I'm not sure. I scratch my head. They're still getting stock out as far as crude and energy. They're still able to do business to a fairly large degree. And where does it all end? What's trying to be achieved here? That's the issue. When I look at it from a timeline perspective, how does it end?
It's an existential thing for Ukraine, I would suggest. Absolutely fascinating. But I want to move on. I want to spend some time on climate change and energy transition subjects. We had the UAE Climate Technology Summit in Abu Dhabi earlier this week. I was down there. And yesterday, the World Hydrogen Summit in Rotterdam, where Saudi Arabia signed an MOU with the Dutch on green hydrogen development. This followed an earlier one they signed with Germany. So if we can call up the survey question, please. I want to talk about hydrogen, green hydrogen, clean hydrogen in all its forms. So the question I would like to debate in the minutes that remain is this. Green hydrogen has the potential to replace hydrocarbons as the world's primary fuel source and solve the problem of global warming once and for all. And it's a straightforward agree or disagree. Andy, we know all about the pluses that are associated with hydrogen. It's easily available as a byproduct of the oil industry and indeed just in the environment. and depending on how it's manufactured, it can be 100% clean. But I always remember a phrase about hydrogen that I came across, I don't know, a year or so ago, that the problems are that it is both expensive and explosive, which makes it impractical for long-term fuel use. What do you think? Is it practical?
Well, I think both those two things, expensive and explosive. They said the same thing about LNG in the 1960s when Algeria opened its first plant in Iran. And I think long term that the technical challenges around shipment, around cost effectiveness of producing hydrogen can be overcome in the same way that the LNG industry went from where it was at the dawn of that industry in the 1960s in North Africa through to where we are now. So yeah, I think it is the future, and I think that producers in the Middle East are in a position. For me, it's, are we going to be talking in 30 years' time, not about OPEC, but about the hydrogen equivalent of OPEC? And actually, if we were, it would be the same players in charge of it. It would be the Saudi Arabias and the United Arab Emirates, because they have the abundant resources to be able to create the blue and the green hydrogen. So, it's what does it change in the world? And, coming back to the survey question, is it the magic bullet for climate change? And I would say on its own, no, not at this point. It's part of a big basket of policy measures and different modes of energy transmission that need to be introduced, as well as tackling emissions. And this is very much in the rhetoric now, policymakers. You've had Jabba talk a lot around that recently. It's not the actual crude that's to blame here, it's the emissions, and we need to deal with the emissions. So, let's not forget carbon capture. Let's not forget other ways to take away the emissions, like sequestration. So it's going to be very, important going forward, and that's why we've had these, quite eye-catching deals with the Netherlands and Saudi Arabia recently. The Saudis, they did a deal with Japan. I think it was back in March as well. We're going to export
blue ammonium. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
The current setup, or the setup that they would like to put in place, as I understand it, is that the clean hydrogen is made in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, using German technology, and is then exported to Holland for distribution throughout Europe, Germany included. So that's the kind of scenario. And NEOM, of course, this huge, hugely ambitious, as they say, venture, will be the biggest clean hydrogen plant in the world when it's up and running. Matt, so let me ask you, have you given any thoughts to the logistics of shipping hydrogen around the world? It is explosive, of course. We have enough problems with crude, don't we? Do we really want to add the challenges of moving a volatile substance like hydrogen around the world's oceans?
I haven't given it a lot of thought, but we have seen a few cargoes that are, there's been a lot of press around them. And it's interesting. You've got to start trying it. You've got to start working it out. You've got to start testing the problems and working out, in exactly the same point. Like, the idea of transporting LNG, a couple of decades ago would have been ridiculous. But it's
interesting point that Andy made there. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And the order book for LNG vessels outstrips absolutely anything out there in the market. So it's just a matter of time. I think whether hydrogen. I generally agree with Andrew. I think hydrogen will form a part of it. I think globally, we've massively underinvested in nuclear power over the last 50 years, which is we've been scared of it rather than lean into it and try to solve some of those problems. But yeah, absolutely, it's going to form a huge part of it, but it's not the silver bullet on its own. Okay,
can we see the survey result, please? Can you pull that up? See how we all went. Oh, right, that's rather a bigger split than I thought. So people, on the whole, don't think it will replace hydrocarbons. I guess we're all oil people, aren't we? So what else would we say? But Peter, let me come to you for a final word. Of course, if green hydrogen does take off as the fuel of the future, it will need a global trading system, a global market to make it work. From a market point of view, have you given any thought to that?
No, I haven't, Frank, but I'm sure that naturally clearinghouses and futures exchanges and how that all integrates into, from a commercial side of it, speculators and the commercials, it'll just be, I think, another form of contract, if that's how it, I can't see the futures industry necessarily capitulating in the foreseeable future. So I feel as though that would be a normal mechanism for transaction, and that's the way of doing business. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I very much like. I recall a book. I had the good fortune when I was at Wharton in 2004 to have Jeremy Rifkin present, and he came in and he wrote a book on the hydrogen economy, and it's just so interesting to see it 20 years later, and it's starting to gain even more traction. So yeah, let's see how it all plays out over the next 10 years. Yeah, let's see. Well, look, guys, thank you very much indeed. What a really interesting discussion on a wide range of things. So Peter Maguire, thank you very much. Matt Wright, Andy Critchlow too. Very nice to see you again. I'm off to read all about the Battle of Kursk in 1943, and we will talk about this again, I'm sure. Thank you all very much. Have a great weekend, and I hope we speak again soon. Bye. Thank you, Frank.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.